I have a brother here who's going to do a recitation from the Qur'an. What he will do is he'll read a passage from the Qur'an and he will recite it for you. And I hope you enjoy it, even though you're not going to understand it. Try to listen to the essence of it, and it's beautiful Arabic. So you have the honor of listening to a short recitation.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم كافها يا عين صاد ذكر رحمة ربك عبده زكريا إذ نادى ربه نداء خفيا قال رب إني وهن العظم مني واشتعل الرأس شيبا ولم أكن بدعائك رب شقيا وإني خفت الموالي من ورائي وكانت امرأتي عاقرا فهب لي من لدنك وليا يرثني ويرث من آل يعقوب واجعله رب رضيا يا زكريا إنا نبشرك بغلام اسمه يحيى لم نجعل له من قبل سميا قال رب أنى يكون لي غلام وكانت امرأتي عاقرا وقد بلغت من الكبر عتيا قال كذلك قال ربك هو علي هين وقد خلقتك من قبل ولم تك شيئا صدق الله العظيم.
This is a recital of the mercy of your Lord to his servant Zechariah. Behold, that is Zechariah, he cried to his Lord in secret, praying, O my Lord, infirm indeed are my bones, and the hair of my head does glisten with grey. But never am I unblessed, O my Lord, in my prayer to you. Now I fear what my relatives and colleagues will do after me. But my wife is barren, so give me an heir as from yourself, one that will truly represent me, and represent the posterity of Jacob, and make him, O my Lord, one with whom you are well pleased. His prayer was answered. O Zechariah, we give you good news of a son. His name will be John the Baptist. On none by that name have we conferred distinction before. He said, O my Lord, how shall I have a son when my wife is barren and I have grown quite decrepit from old age? He said, so it will be, your Lord says, that is easy for me. I did indeed create you before when you had been nothing. Zechariah said, O my Lord, give me a sign. Your sign was the answer, shall be that you shall speak to no man for 3 nights, although you are not dumb. So Zechariah came out to his people from his chamber. He told them by signs to celebrate God's praises in the morning and in the evening. That's essentially the opening chapter of Mary, deals with the birth of John the Baptist, and subsequently we see later on, maybe in question time, we have the birth of Jesus enumerated as well.
Can you speak a little bit about jihad?
Okay. That sometimes requires an hour to lecture, but sometimes I'll have to obviously keep it as quickly as possible because we are running at a premium. I said that there are certain words and phrases in Arabic which should be viewed in the generic sense, like the term Islam, like the term Muslim, and jihad is one of them. The word jihad basically is derived from the root word jahada, which means struggle. And the struggle could take place in many manifestations. In its root form, it simply means struggle. The word for holy war in Arabic is al-harb al-muqaddasatu, which means the holy war. Harb meaning war, muqaddasatu meaning holy war. In the Qur'an and in the entire Islamic tradition, that word is non-existent. The word holy war is non-existent in Islamic terminology. the very first time that this word was used was in the context of the Crusades, where this word was basically came up where Pope Urban II basically told his crusaders to go and liberate Jerusalem, engage in the Holy War. If you probably saw Kingdom of Heaven, you would have a glimpse or an inkling of what that basically means. So having acknowledged that the word holy war is not to be found in the Qur'an, it is not to be found in Islamic terminology, and that the word jihad is derived from the root word jahada, which simply means to struggle, therefore this kind of struggle could take form in various manifestations. In the Qur'an, for example, there is a chapter called Surah Luqman. Sometimes some commentators identify him with one of the prophets of Arabia, not to be found in the Bible. And in Surah Luqman, which is the, I think the 33rd or the 31st chapter, there is a verse where he basically addresses his son, or God tells the father to address his son. He says, "Oh, my son, that in days gone by your parents basically have raised you up, so therefore show gratitude to your particular parents." Then it goes on to say that if your polytheistic parents, those who are polytheists, if they force you to engage in acts of idolatry, then you do not obey them in acts of idolatry, but still you bear them out in good company. In this life, you look after them, you still maintain your relationships with them, but you do not obey them in the act of idolatry, in other words, worshipping idols. Now, the point I'm trying to emphasize here is that in that verse itself, the verse in question says, if your polytheistic parents force you to commit idolatry, obey them not. And in that verse, the word for force or for strive, the word used is jihad. So if I were to transliterate that particular verse as opposed to translating it, it would basically say that, look, if your polytheistic parents engage in jihad to force you to commit idolatry, then do not obey them. But it doesn't now literally mean that your parents are engaging in a holy war with you. They are simply engaging in duress upon you, are simply struggling to get you to their particular form of worship. The point I'm trying to emphasize that in this context, the word jihad here is basically used in describing an attribute which is performed by polytheists. So it means that it's essentially generic. It's not a terminology which is solely unique to the Muslim holy war or to the Islamic terrorist. It's used in a generic format. Further on, you find in many passages of the Quran, it says the believers strive in the path of God, and those who engage in oppression and the evil one strives in the path of Satan, or those who have satanic inclinations. Now, does this mean that Satan literally engages in jihad? Does he perform a holy war? Absolutely not. But in the meaning, the term is purely generic. When you look, for example, at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, when they were experiencing a great amount of boycott and they were subjected to economic embargoes, people were not trading with them, in that context, they were told to exercise patience. And the word used there was jihad. The struggle is basically patience. So, for example, by extension, if many of you are going and writing your particular examinations at Whitworth University, and you're striving and you're struggling and you're preparing to study, you are engaging in jihad without you knowing it, but you're actually engaging in jihad. So it doesn't mean now that you're engaging in some kind of holy war, but jihad in the essence, the actual struggle. So I would say that that's how this particular word needs to be viewed. It needs to be divorced from its kind of, the stereotypical appellations that have accumulated over the past decade, over the past 2 decades. And it's interesting that this term, in fact, first got such a popular usage after the Iranian Revolution in '79. Before '79, well, that verse or that word was basically unheard of. People were more interested in the Beatles and more interested in Elvis and more interested in going to Woodstock. But afterwards, subsequently, with the new culture and with the decline of communism as the next global threat, you find that this is basically viewed as something to be afraid of and something to be frightened of. But actually, if you look at the Quran, it's divorced of all the sinister manifestations that one might basically read about in the mass media. Hope that answers the question. I know we are pressed for time, and I tend to get to stretch it a bit. Some say I've got verbal diarrhea, but I'll give this to Professor. I'll give the floor over to Professor to address us, and then I've just got a PowerPoint presentation that I've prepared for you with certain satirical images that you might enjoy. So I'll hand the floor over to Professor. I might also add that I saw his your schedule yesterday, which the Professor kind-heartedly gave to me, and I must say I'm quite impressed with what you people at Whitworth University do. It's not known in South Africa. I'm not so sure if any of the other major universities engage in such a comprehensive workshop as you guys do, and I think for that your professor deserves an applause.
Well, and you should know this program has been put together over many years by a number of professors, and I have 3 colleagues here today. And you talk about verbal diarrhea, but one thing I don't think anyone would accuse you is of the other side of that, mental constipation. And I've always enjoyed being with Yusuf, who's an attorney, and is one of the sharpest minds of anybody I've ever met, I think. I just want to make a few remarks about conversations between Muslims and Christians. And last time we were here, I referred to the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I sometimes look at the world and think of all the problems the world is in. And it's sort of like the world is that person who's laying there beside the road, bruised and wounded. You think about the poverty, the problems with the environment, HIV/AIDS, all the kinds of things the world is facing. And I sometimes worry that the world that is not Christian, the world that is not Muslim, looks at us as Christians and Muslims and thinks of us sort of like the priest and Levite who walk by. And we're too busy as Christians and Muslims sometimes debating and arguing and competing with each other instead of coming together when we can and addressing the serious, serious problems the world faces. Because after all, we all are children of Abraham. We all are people who worship the same God. We're people who share so many things. And I don't want to gloss over the differences, because it's not fair to say that Muslims and Christians are exactly the same. They're not. We have differences, but we share many, many things. And I would hope that as we walk down the road and see people who are on the side of the road in need, that as Christians and Muslims, that we join together. As I was thinking about this, I thought about sort of another analogy, using the parable of the Good Samaritans. And maybe in some ways, we as Christians and Muslims are also the person who's wounded, lying by the side of the road. We face some real problems that I think we need to work together and try to address. And there are 2 that I just want to mention that I think have deeply, deeply hurt both Christians and Muslims in our communities. And one is the issue of violence. And I think we have to be honest that there are many Christians who have misused violence, who see violence as a proper way to solve problems, and there are Muslims who've thought about that in the same way. And it seems to me both we as Christians and people who are Muslims need to go back to our scriptures and think together about how do we work together for peace instead of violence. Another problem I think we have that has wounded, troubled all of us, is the kind of secularization that you see around the world. And we've had conversations with our host families probably about the power of television, the kind of things that come on TV, movies, the kind of things that undermine families, family values, and that certainly is a problem for Muslims and a problem for Christians. And I hope that together, those are some things that we can work on and ask, how do we together address those things and resolve those things? So those would be my brief thoughts.
And I just want to read just which echoes something which Professor stated. There's an interesting book which I'd probably urge all of you to get. It's written by a Professor Michel Chossudovsky from, he's the center of, he's a professor of economics at the University of Ottawa and director for the Center of Research on Globalization. And he's got an interesting book called The Globalization of Poverty and the New World Order. And in the introduction he states, humanity is undergoing in the post-Cold War era an economic and social crisis of unprecedented scale, leading to the rapid impoverishment of large sectors of world populations. National economies are collapsing and unemployment is rampant. Local urban famines have erupted in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, parts of Latin America. This globalization of poverty, which has largely reversed the achievements of post-war decolonization, was initiated in the Third World, coinciding with the debt crisis of the early 1980s and the imposition of the IMF's deadly economic reforms. The New World Order feeds on human poverty and the destruction of the national environment. It generates social apartheid, encourages racism and ethnic strife, undermines the rights of women, and often precipitates countries into destructive confrontations between nationalities. And, I think it was read pretty fast, but essentially, the problems that you find in the world today are by and large as a result of these so-called major international instruments that are in place that are basically geared to cause devastation in parts of the Third World. Sometimes, as individuals, we need to embrace our common humanity and go beyond nationalism or nationhood and so on. And in the context of this presentation, I'll just illustrate certain key points that I think you'll probably agree to, obey. And you've got people sitting in front of a television screen. We as human beings are generally controlled by mass hypnosis. If you look around, it's so easy and so simple to basically train or coerce or influence a particular group of people to think according to a particular line, sometimes taking absolutist positions. A country and a people who were so cultured and who basically celebrated the works of Goethe and Beethoven were brainwashed and systematically programmed into thinking nothing about the incineration of 7 million Jewish people and gypsies and other individuals and the oppression of homosexuals and so on. Total destruction of society. That's because that the powers that be are so easily at manipulating the global mass consensus. If you look at something like sheep, if you look at the concept of a sheep and the principle of a sheepdog, the sheep individually is one of the most difficult animals to control and to pick. But in a flock, they're exceptionally easy to control. Because more often than not, you've got the sheepdog. The sheepdog controls the sheep. But we as human beings, by and large, we seem to out-sheep the sheep. Because we police each other. We seem to basically erect artificial barriers and artificial social constructs. And anybody who has a different opinion or a dissent from the established norm or what is viewed as established view is basically ridiculed and insulted and eliminated from the kind of mainstream of society. There's an old Chinese proverb which says, don't be like the nail that stands out because it'll be the first one that gets hit through. And you basically look at human society and how it's evolved and how it's developed, you basically find that the thing that stands up is the first to basically get knocked down. We basically out-sheep the sheep and sometimes outmaneuver them in terms of how we control each other, how we police each other. He's right, he's a doctor, or he's a lawyer, he has to know, or he's a professor, with due respect to Professor Yoda. But we don't adopt, we don't embrace our whole, we don't embrace our individuality. We basically acquiescence to what the dominant status quo tells us. Now, this is something which is quite interesting because the analogy applies to what we have in society around us. And why I always show this particular slide, and particularly the picture that follows after this, is that it tells us a lot. The analogy has behind us. We sometimes see what we are told to see, but we don't see behind the thin veneer. In the 1950s, you found there was an experiment conducted when subliminal images were used in theaters. They announced a 58% increase in Coke sales. What they do, they'd have an advert, and they'd have a split second an image of Coke. And you'd go to the tea room and you don't know what draws you, but somehow you are drawn to purchase that particular item. When they made the movie called The Exorcist, they found that people were leaving the theater and they started vomiting. But subliminally, the actual director had pigs grunting in the background when he was actually making the movie. They added that particular sound effect, and people couldn't identify what was affecting them. So subliminal images affect us unknowingly, affecting our decision making, our train of thought and beliefs. What may appear as normal is in fact highly abnormal in nature. And this bodes well for what we see around us. How many of us, for example, accept what we see in the news, in the mass media? Government says this, or State Department says this, President Zuma says this, the Department of Health says this, and we just simply accept them. And more often than not, many of the real hardcore journalists will tell you that the truth sometimes lies in the bottom. The truth actually lies at the periphery with mainstream society as opposed to the establishment. So I would suggest that when you see something, when you come across something, is it telling you something, or is there something behind? Is there a veneer behind what it wants to tell you? For example, what do we have here? We've got roses, and we've got beautiful plants and flowers, and they give us a hint here. They've got something, they've got a little dove there, and they've got a bee perhaps collecting nectar. And there's a subliminal image. They say about probably 50% or 70% don't see this. Only about 30% pick up the subliminal image that's found in this particular message. But your subconscious is trained. Your subconscious has already picked it up. Your subconscious has internalized the particular image, and it will remain there, and subconsciously it will affect you. The answer to this is if you look and concentrate on the white section below the plants, what you see, you can see clearly an S, clearly an E, and clearly an X. And they give you a hint. It's the birds and the bees. But now for the first time, you'd basically be seeing it. It'll hit you directly. So if I move a slide here and I move here, the word hits you directly because your conscious mind has basically been brought in tune with your subconscious. But prior to that, you couldn't see the word sex there. It's not there. But basically your subconscious mind has been told. It tells you, it programs you, and it remains there. And these images remain with us forever. And we begin to question that if something can be manipulated, if humans can be manipulated through consumerism, through the material world, what stops us from being manipulated by what we see? What stops us from being manipulated by the establishment, by whatever we feel, by people who want to introduce legislation to further curtail our rights and the rights of our children and grandchildren thereafter? Do we ever take a step to stand back, step aside and see, is there a bigger picture behind what we see? Another interesting ad. This is a Camel advert. And I never believed this when I was first told. I don't know if there's any cigarette smokers here.